very honored today to have as our guest the instructor of Mini MBA, Unlocking the Ivory Tower, Joseph LiPuma. He's also a professor, and he's the director of International MBA program at the EM-Lyon Business School in France, and he's joining us from there tonight. So hopefully there are some people from Europe that are able to join us for this hangout that haven't gone to bed too early. Welcome, Joe.
Great to be here.
Let's just jump into, we were going to talk about strategy and entrepreneurship. What does studying early models of strategy, how does it help someone think strategically in their own company?
Well, strategy isn't really that old of a field. It's 40, 50 years old, and by looking at how the field has evolved, how people think about how business works and how to approach business, understanding some of those models can really help clear up some of the confusion and help to break down this big amorphous, what do I do with my business, how do things actually work, into some chunks and some bite-sized pieces that you can actually then use to enact change in your business, understand the market, understand industries. And so they're really helpful in terms of doing that, not just looking broadly and saying, what do I do? Use some of these models. Things have evolved and developed quite a lot over the last, as I said, the last 30, 40 years.
And I do want to apologize. There is a form on Google that on these Hangouts that if you don't push it by the time you do the broadcast, people can't ask questions. And unfortunately, we do not have a question app. But we do have, I've got several questions here that we're going to be going through today, but my apologies in that the question app was not initiated before the broadcast began. Joe, you talk about the first chapter on strategy, about analyzing the environment in the company and planning what to do based on that analysis. But the second chapter on entrepreneurship seems to suggest that finding opportunities is most important. Can you plan to find opportunities, or do strategy and entrepreneurship look at different things?
Yeah, it's a nice question. Strategy seems to be something where the models exist. You look at these things and they help you to understand how, in some ways, how big companies work, how you can plan, how you can organize, how you can have foresight into what might happen, thinking about things like real options. What are my options for the future? How do I understand those? How do I understand the market? How do I understand industries? Where, as you say, in thinking about entrepreneurship, opportunities are the real important thing. Opportunities are something that might not exist everywhere. And how do you plan for opportunities? Do you sit around waiting for an opportunity to happen so you can then think about your strategy? Well, in some way, it's the case, but in some ways it's not. Entrepreneurship is about figuring out what those opportunities are, and then once you find those opportunities, you use the same strategy, tools, and approaches and concepts to do something with that opportunity, to turn it into a real business. When you're thinking about developing a business plan for a new business, it may be based on an idea, it may be based on taking that idea from just something that's seen in the market, something that is a gap that bothers you, and saying, how can I derive value from that? How can I turn that into an opportunity? And as you go through writing a business plan, thinking about how you do that, you use some of the same tools that are in the strategy portfolio: industry analysis, market segmentation, understanding your resources and capabilities within the firm, to then develop the approach that you're going to take to actually enact that opportunity. So they're not, there's a distinction in terms of strategy and entrepreneurship, but they dovetail and complement each other well as you develop your business.
How does competition really relate to strategy?
Well, the idea of competition is that it's how do you compete, and how do you compete is part and parcel of your competition. You need to think about, what is it, first of all, what is my competition? How does my competition act, and what is the basis for their competition? Porter talks about looking at things like, are you competing in terms of cost? Are you trying to be the low-cost provider? Are you competing in terms of differentiation, having a differentiable product or differentiable offering? So that's one big element of that. And what you need to be able to do is not just compete for today, but think about, how do I gain a competitive advantage that's sustainable? And so I need to think about, what are the elements that I have in my portfolio, that I have in my resources, that might be rare, that might be difficult to imitate, that might be based on a particular location, that allow me to take and sustain that competitive edge and competitive advantage, not just now, but into the future. Things are changing rapidly now. We see that the life cycle of products is a lot shorter than it was. We see that companies now are coming into the market, and in a matter of a few years are gaining millions, if not hundreds of millions, of subscribers. Look at what Facebook did, and others. How do you do that? How do you compete against someone or a company like that? How do you jump into those markets? And it's thinking about not just what's going to happen today, but where are things going in the future, and how can I keep the advantage that I have now moving into the future in a hyperactive or hyper-competitive market.
And going along with that, how do transaction costs really relate to strategy?
Well, the idea of transaction costs is that when you think about how can I reduce the cost of how I do business, the whole notion of make versus buy, or do these within my hierarchy, do this within my company to reduce transaction costs, are important. The idea of transaction costs are that within a company I can reduce those costs by being able to have routines or processes in place that reduce the amount of information that I might need to transmit in order to get something done. If I'm walking across the hall to another department asking them to do something, I don't need to write a contract with them necessarily. I don't need to go to the market and search for a particular provider to give me what I need. I can walk across the hall. I know a department might have something that I need, or be able to satisfy a need that I have. So it reduces my search costs, it reduces my costs of contracting, and that can be significant in terms of a competitive advantage, in that my costs are lower, my time is quicker to get to the market, and that can become a great competitive advantage. On the other side, by going within the hierarchy, by sometimes reducing those elements of transaction costs, you might actually, though, get away from some options that you might have outside the market, or you might get into particular ways of thinking that might not take advantage of the newest technologies or new opportunities that may exist. In the book, we touch on different elements of that in different chapters, and as we get into things later in the book and in innovation, we touch on some of these same elements, but you look at what happens when you move outside the company, and how do you deal with some of the innovative aspects, and how do they help you in your competitive landscape.
We do have some viewers. Again, I want to make my apologies because the question app was not initiated, and Google doesn't let you do that. But on the Google page for Joe's chat, there is a place for comments. So if you do, I'm keeping an eye on that. So if people want to ask Professor Joe LiPuma a question on strategy and entrepreneurship, you can just write it in that comment area, and I can go ahead and find that for you. There's a lot of talk about game theory. How much can managers or executives really use game theory in real life?
Well, game theory was developed by economists, and there are certain techniques that are used in there, and there's a lot of application. The point in this, in game theory for managers, is to look at how game theory works, to say how my actions and the actions of others impact the decisions that myself and others make, and recognizing that, in fact, this isn't a static environment in which people are working. So understanding how the motivations of one person or another might impact the actions of myself or others is important. You might not be able to quantify it in the same way that you would if you were doing a game theoretic model like the prisoner's dilemma, but understanding that the actions that one person takes affects others, and how it affects things, and being able to make the best decision is important.
When you talk about the strategic capabilities of a company, I realize this was Eric's part of the book, but he talks about choosing ambitious goals that are beyond the firm's existing capabilities. Why would you do that?
The idea is if you don't set lofty goals, you don't set high goals, you're going to be mired and stuck in current ways of thinking. And there's a great way to motivate people. If you look at what's happened in the past, how did we get to the moon in the 60s? John Kennedy setting great goals, saying we're going to do this, and people rally and get around that by having an objective, a broad objective that everyone can get behind. People get motivated and act as one. That particular case was just amazing when you look at how that worked. If you don't set the big goals and you just do things incrementally, there's going to be others out there who move along. The market moves fast, and if you're not able to set those, paint a vision, get people behind this, you're not going to succeed in business today. And the big goals are things that move companies along. Now, I mentioned before, other chapters of the book, in terms of innovation, we'll talk about things like incremental innovation versus radical innovation. And if you look at, most of the innovation that happens now in these days is incremental. It's not necessarily setting the big goal. It's how can we take this and move it a step forward. And there's certain progress that can happen in those cases, but setting the big goals to what can we do, how can we make something radically different is the way in which big changes happen, big changes in the market.
People talk about competitive strategy in terms of what's outside firm, and others like Werner Felt and Barney view the resources inside the firm as critical for competitive advantage. Which is it?
It's both. When we think about this, if we just look inside the firm, certainly we need to understand what capabilities and what resources we have within our firm to be able to act, and those are important. We can't act in a strategic sense without knowing what resources we have at our disposal. And having a good view on those and how they can provide an advantage to you is important. And when we look at things like resources I mentioned before that are rare, those that others that may not be available to all, because it might be someone who has a degree or some knowledge in some very esoteric area. So that rare resource, something that's very difficult to imitate, or it might take a lot of cost and time to imitate, the person with the knowledge of something that's rare and esoteric is a good example of that. It's something that they've developed over a number of years, and if you're trying to imitate that, you've got to develop that by sending a bunch of people to get their PhDs in astrophysics or nanotechnology, whatever. Very difficult to do. So you need to understand what's inside the firm. However, if you base your strategy just on what you have, and even what you think you can acquire, there are other competitors out there who are doing some of the same thing. And you might limit yourself on what you're able to do just based on what you have. So looking outside the firm, doing industry analysis, looking at the dynamics within an industry, things that affect market entry, that other people getting into the industry, elements that affect suppliers and what gives suppliers power, buyers power, understanding what the competitive landscape is of the main players or drivers in an industry are important. Again, understanding what happens outside so you can plan your strategy to work within that structure is important. So you need to balance these two. You need to have, on the one hand, fair knowledge of what is inside your firm that you can then use to your advantage, and balancing that against what's outside the firm. If those two are radically out of sync, if you're in an industry where having certain types of resources isn't an advantage, then moving forward with those resources into an area isn't going to necessarily help you. So it is both. You can't just look at one or the other. You need to balance both the external view of what's going on in the industry and what the main dynamics are there with what capabilities and resources you have and what you might need to do to augment that, and have a good understanding of what others have, and recognize also that the nature of what's outside the firm and the industry is geographically mediated, in that that it's not universal. So things that your industry in the Bay Area or in the U.S. is different than the industry in Europe, is different than the industry in China. And so understanding what capabilities you have relative to those environments helps you to also then determine where can I operate that might give me a competitive advantage. If not in the U.S., then maybe I can go to Europe. If not in Europe, then maybe I can go to China with these resources and capabilities that I have, because the external environment is one that maps nicely to what I have and where I can get a competitive advantage and I can succeed.
We'll jump into entrepreneurship, but let's keep on the international scope a little bit, because you hear, we get questions all the time in a lot of the KFA classes and all that of, international students who are a little bit frustrated. They want to get started, entrepreneurial communities started, and often in cultures or where the government, has strict regulations, that sort of thing, the source of funds come from very traditional sources, old families, institutions, etc. How can you foster an entrepreneurial community in these more traditional cultures?
Well, a lot of it starts with school. You look at things like, in Scotland a few years back, there was some initiatives to start teaching entrepreneurship to 5-year-olds and just getting people to understand what entrepreneurship is. So what you need to do is start even at that early of an age and getting that culture embedded. It's teaching people stories. Culture exists and it gets embedded in societies because it's based on the fairy tales we tell our kids, and those have some. Trying to change those takes a lot of times takes generations. That's one thing. You start with teaching kids, and they grow up with that mindset. So that's one element. The second is dealing with government and regulation. So one of the things that you mentioned, Rusty, is about the source of funds. And some of it isn't just a matter of people wanting to or thinking about investing. It certainly is the case in certain areas, and I'll touch on that in a second. But that government regulations don't permit certain types of investments. So in France, for example, pension funds cannot invest in do risky investments like venture capital. So as a result, the venture capital market in France is much smaller than it is in the U.S. If you look at the average venture capital investment in the U.S., it might be in the order of 40%. VCs own 30 to 40% of a company at the time of an IPO or the time it gets sold. In France, it's 4%. So that's one element. The other is that exits. VCs like to be able to invest in opportunities where they can get an exit, where something can be sold easily, or if there's an option for an IPO for the company to go on a public market. If there's no exit market, there's going to be more reluctance to invest in a company. So that's so the regulations are an important piece of that. And then beyond that, there's also the element of intellectual property protection. So there's these broad things. Again, it's going to, in this particular case of intellectual property, investors won't invest in something where they can't get the returns, and entrepreneurs won't take the effort to build and develop something if what they build can be easily appropriated from them, taken by the government, taken by others. So some of it has to do with the regulations. I think those are big things. If you look at China, the one-child policy has had an impact on entrepreneurship, and that where does the money come from? If you think about some of what we think about as the sources of funds for young companies, friends and family. Family might be the rich uncle. Well, China, there's no rich uncles. The one-child policy over the last generations, there's no rich uncles. Right? So where does the money come from? And without a strong social safety net, people can't invest in their child's business, or a child might have to take care of their parents. How do these things affect moving into entrepreneurship? So I think the big things are really teaching people at an early age, getting people to think about taking taking risks and dealing with uncertainty, and certain cultures do better than that than others, and dealing with the regulatory environment so that people are protected and there's a sense of being able to put money into these types of entrepreneurial ventures and have an ability to get it out and derive some of the value from that personally.
It's such a buzzword today, entrepreneurship. You know, how does studying it help? Don't actions speak louder than words in this case?
You know, there is a lot of that, and there's no doubt that doing is important. But some of the key things about entrepreneurship. First, you know, that kind of leaves the question: can entrepreneurship be taught, or, you know, are entrepreneurs taught, or are they born? And there are traits that certain people have in terms of their willingness to deal with ambiguity and uncertainty. So that's one thing. But the studying part of it is really about how do I really look at opportunities? How do I take something that I see and be able to turn that from a neat idea into a real opportunity? And studying it helps in terms of the process by which you do that. The other part is, in terms of studying it, it's something that we do very much at EM-Lyon, is everyone takes entrepreneurship, and we do a lot with people working with entrepreneurs, doing projects, and people setting up and doing their own projects. Now, a lot of schools in entrepreneurship have business plan competitions and do business plans, and it's a good way for people to get their hands dirty doing it. You know, but doing it in that context where it's a little safer to fail is a nice way to learn, and, you know, by doing, not in the sense where I'm going out and putting you know, $50,000 or euros or pounds of my own money into something without having had the advantage of trying it in a safe environment of a school.
But isn't failure all part of the entrepreneurial spirit, that sort of thing, and people have to learn from it? And is failure more acceptable in the U.S. than in other countries? Oh,
absolutely. Failure is in some cultures. Failing is frowned upon and looked upon, and so you get people who take very conservative conservative actions. The U.S. is definitely an outlier in that let's try things, fails, okay, pick ourselves up, dust off our pants and get up and try it again. So that is something. So failure is more accepted in the U.S. And so how do you deal with that if you're in a country or a culture where failure is not as accepted? Entrepreneurship still has to develop and work and thrive there. And so how do you do that? And maybe the way to do that is to have more education for it, so the failure happens within a safe environment, like I just said, and not out in the market. It's okay to fail when you're in school because you're in school. There's no social stigma about failing and trying to do a business there. It's a little bit, so it's a little bit safer environment. In the U.S. it doesn't matter as much. You fail in school, you fail outside, it's okay. Some cultures, it's better to fail in school in these projects than get out and you're successful outside.
And speaking of how does understanding where entrepreneurs come from, how does that help facilitate entrepreneurship?
Well, it gets into a couple things. One is what do we as managers how do we deal with people internally that might be entrepreneurial, and how do we support and relish that entrepreneurial interest of our employees in a way that allows us to tap into it and utilize it and derive value from it for ourselves and for the employee, so that he stays in the company with his entrepreneurial mindset, with his entrepreneurial ambitions, and derive value from that, and I derive value as a manager, lest he decide that this isn't going to work and I'll leave the company and go somewhere else and do my own entrepreneurial thing. So as managers, it's important for us to understand that. As policymakers, if we're in government, it's important for us to understand that, say, what do we need to do to put in place to help provide an environment where there's supporting structure around for entrepreneurs, and understanding where people come from, how many entrepreneurs can be supported in an environment, and what we need to do to support those entrepreneurs who are in the environment is important. The idea is that maybe the environment can only handle so many entrepreneurs. We think about Silicon Valley. There's a lot of people there who have money who can support entrepreneurs in terms of capital. There's a lot of good schools there who can spawn entrepreneurs and develop those. That's not true universally. Okay, so what do we need to do if we're somewhere else to develop an environment that allows us to have a number of entrepreneurs there? And that's also in terms of the number of workers to support those entrepreneurs, the number of support services. In one case, again, the Bay Area is Silicon Valley, where there's tons of support for those. That's not true if we're dealing with places in it might not be in China or in South America. There's cities and environments where that isn't the case.
How about within a company? You don't usually think about entrepreneurs working for a big company, but is it healthy for managers to sort of foster an entrepreneurial spirit among the employees? I mean, is that healthy? Is that good?
I think it's not only healthy and good. It's an imperative. Not everyone wants to be an entrepreneur, and I think a good manager knows how to get the best out of his people and help them to perform to the best of their capabilities. But for those who want to be entrepreneurs, who have the capability to do so, fostering that can be great. It's not the case that it's only the managers or only the people at the top who are the ones who have the ideas, who see the opportunities. In fact, it's often the case that the ones who are closer to the product, closer to production, closer to the customers, are the ones who really see the opportunities. And if people aren't inspired to be entrepreneurs, if people aren't motivated to act on their on what they view and their entrepreneurial tendencies, the companies are going to miss something. They're not going to take advantage of that, and those are going to be the ones who are going to be the dinosaurs in the future. So you really need to get people to do that. There's going to be the ones who identify and see a new product area and product line, and part of it is to just to celebrate that. Celebrate when someone comes up with an idea and brings it in and works with it. So you develop a culture of entrepreneurship. And the second is to put motivators in place so that when someone does do that, they gain by that through stock or bonuses or whatever. That they derive value from that. So I think it's beyond just good. I think it's an imperative, and I think that's why you see in business schools, entrepreneurship was in a small percentage of business schools 10 years back. If you look now, most every business school has entrepreneurship as part of its program, its MBA program or other programs. There's a recognition that this is a critical part of business, and you see things like entrepreneurship and corporate entrepreneurship as courses and main elements. Entrepreneurship isn't just about going out and starting your own business. It's taking on this mindset of identifying opportunities and analyzing them and enacting them, whether you're doing it for yourself and your own business, whether you're doing it for a company, whether you're doing it for an NGO, or whether you're doing it for a government to take an opportunistic view of things. So this idea of entrepreneurship transcends business, and I think we all need to be pushing each other in our associations within our companies or outside to do more entrepreneurial thinking.
One last question for the hangout that we've been talking about how managers can foster it, but what about, I think people either see themselves as an entrepreneur or not. What if you do have an idea but you've never looked at yourself as an entrepreneur? How do you sort of encourage your own spirit? How do you get yourself to take advantage of opportunities, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I know. I think that somehow comes from within. I think it's a nice way of doing that. If I have this idea, is talk about it. Talk to people about it. One mistake that entrepreneurs make oftentimes is they say, "I've got this great idea, but I need to keep it close to me. I can't tell anyone about it because they'll steal it from me." And really, just the opposite is true. If I've got this idea, but I'm a little uncertain, talk to people. Talk to people about it. You'll learn a lot from them. You'll get the perspectives on it. And you probably get a lot of encouragement for people saying, "That's a great idea. You should do something with that." And sometimes that encouragement from others, just from talking about it, may actually push you to do that. And you may find some people out there who are willing to provide some money, provide some advice, provide some, people might say, "Hey, if you do that, I'll join you. I'll work for you." And that's pretty encouraging when someone says, "I'll join you on that."
Exactly. Well, thank you, Professor Joe LiPuma, instructor and author, mini MBA, and the book Unlocking the Ivory Tower. Thank you so much for your time, and I do apologize again to everyone for not being able to ask questions during the event. And hopefully, and next time, I promise that won't happen, and I think next time we'll be talking to Joe's co-instructor, Eric Ball. So again, Joe, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Rusty. Enjoyed it.